First things first, my intention with this video is not to sell you Trigger or her weapon. In fact, I will actively try to discourage you from pulling for Trigger if you cannot acquire her signature as well. I do, however, want to talk about just how incredibly strong Trigger can be with her weapon in the current state of the game. As per usual, neither Trigger nor her weapon are required to clear any endgame content. You will be fine just right without her and also without her weapon. And lastly, neither me nor you can see into the future, and hence, while Trigger might be stupidly good in the current state of the game, that does not mean she will age well. In this essay, I want to talk about Trigger and her weapon just a bit more, and why her weapon is one of the best weapons Hoyo has released so far in ZZZ. We will compare her to other choices in 3 different teams, talk about the best free-to-play weapons and non-signature options you have, and also talk about the implications and the future of Trigger, so you can decide if pulling for Trigger and possibly her weapon is worth it for you, or not. Timestamps are in the timeline and description. Let's get started. First up, it is important to understand Trigger's value in itself, so let's discuss what Trigger herself actually provides to the team. Outside of the very obvious off-field days she provides as a stun agent, she also gives a 35% stun damage multiplier to the entire team, which is active at all times. This essentially translates into a direct 35% damage increase for the entire team outside of the stun window, and an approximately 23% damage increase during the stun window. If we were to look at Soldier Zero Ambi specifically, that is an increase of roughly 25%, including her time spent both within as well as outside the stun window. Trigger's weapon provides a 25% permanent death shred, which translates into approximately 15% more damage for nearly every team. Adding both damage buffs together, we are looking at approximately 40 to 50% more team damage. And that brings up the question, Riv, what the fuck are you on about? Basically all signature weapons are just really good. And if you've been saying that, you would be right. Somewhat. There are, however, just a very few key differences. First, DPS characters usually have at least one other option, which is only 10 to 15% worse. Heartstring Nocturne for Sambi or Brimstone for Sujuan come to mind. But their respective signature also only apply to their specific character. But Trigger's weapon, well, it not only applies to all carries, it applies to the entire team. It doesn't matter whether or not you pair Trigger with Sambi, Evelynn, Miyabi, or even a DPS Lucy for that matter. Triggers and her weapons buff, those being a permanent 35% stun damage multiplier and a 25% death shred respectively, are so utterly generic and up until now also basically untouched that she will work in all kind of teams. Crit teams, anomaly teams, disorder teams. In fact, her signature alone provides so much damage that it can keep up with or even be slightly better than Sambi's signature weapon, as I have found out during playtesting. Death Shred is currently only accessible via Nicole, and the time during which her 40% Death Shred is active is limited and requires planning and to a certain extent also some skill expression. The stun damage multiplier is usually also only active, well, as the name implies, during the stun window, and up until now only Chingy and Lighter's Mindscape 2 have been increasing it. Except for one exception, all of our stun and support units up until now have been buffing attack, crit damage or some kind of damage percent, which are all stats we can obtain in some way or another, be it from a character's kit, their disk drives, or their weapons. These stats are already saturated, but just as 1.1 times 1.1 is more than 1.2 times 1, the damage formula of ZZZ looks at quite a few different values when calculating damage. The two buffs Trigger and her weapon provide, those being essentially a 35% undiluted damage multiplier outside of the stun window, as well as the permanent 25% death threat from her weapon, those work also with Anomaly and hence also disorder damage. But more importantly, they also do not conflict with other buffers such as Astra or Caesar, which means Trigger scales incredibly well with other buffers. Outside of Rina, that is. Death Threat generally has anti-synergy with pen ratio, as they basically serve the same purpose and are multiplicative with each other. This also means if your teammate is not Rina, Trigger with her weapon is simply so strong that you can slot her into basically any team comp, disregarding the weaknesses, and still come out ahead over other choices, even if Trigger does not actually provide any stun, and if she does, even better. However, to actually come out ahead, we will need her weapon. So let me illustrate that just a bit more, and to do so, let's talk a bit more about Trigger without her weapon. If we were to compare Trigger directly to Nicole, this would look actually pretty bad for Trigger, at least in theory. While the overall potential damage increase Nicole can in theory provide is higher than Trigger's, most players will frankly not achieve that level of performance with Nicole, myself included. Trigger kinda plays like Nicole, but AFK, and while she provides less damage to your carry than Nicole in theory can, she instead offsets this by providing off-field days, which can make Trigger a valid counterpart to Nicole without needing to think a lot. Again, I am looking here at Trigger without her signature weapon. This results in Nicole often being about even or just slightly below Trigger in terms of a team's performance. So how can it be that a premium unit provides roughly the same damage gain as a basically free A rank at this point? Well, the answer is she doesn't. Trigger provides something which Nicole does not, or at least not to that extent: days. And the actual real value of days is incredibly difficult to assess in calculations, which is when playtests are a much better indicator, and so I did that. From personal testing, playing with Trigger versus the likes of Nicole or Caesar, she will grant you about 1 additional stun window in Deadly Assault, 2 for the likes of Nicole or Caesar, and 3 for Trigger. If played incredibly well, I am sure we can maybe even reach 4, but let's just go with 3 for now. That does not only result in 2 additional chain attacks, but also in 500 additional decibel from those chain attacks alone, which can lead to an additional ultimate you otherwise wouldn't have gotten, as well as the damage increase during that stun window, of course. You will, however, likely not get that additional stun window in sheer defense, at least given that your units are built reasonably well. Playtesting various different Zambi teams in Deadly Assault against Corruption Complex with a mid-level investment on Zambi, I achieved 28,600 using Pulchra and Astra, 34,000 using Nicole and Astra, 35,000 with Chingy and Astra, and 36,200 using Astra and Trigger without her signature. When adding Trigger's signature to the mix, it was nearly 45,000. Funnily enough, I also achieved a just slightly higher score using Trigger's signature, while Soldier Zero Ambi had Marcato. This is likely due to error in play, but it just shows how good her signature really is. So what about other teams? Let's also have a look at Miyabi, because that team really likes Astra, and to be honest, kinda every team does, so if Trigger can be a reasonable replacement, that would be great. No. Well, yes. Well, actually, it depends. Do you have Trigger signature? Yes? Great, it's looking really good for you. No? Well, Nicole is gonna be doing the job just as well. Given a mid-level investment for Miyabi and Yanagi, however, both with their signature weapons, Trigger has even been ahead of Astra with her signature weapon. However, without it, she was close to both Astra and Nicole in performance. Don't get me wrong, I think this can be a good thing. She can actually replace Astra in some teams, such as Miyagi teams, and that are fantastic news. However, without her signature, she will also just perform slightly better than Nicole. And I am sure if you can actually play Nicole really well, these scores can be even closer to each other, or maybe Nicole can even come out ahead. So what is my point? Why am I making this video? It is actually quite simple. Trigger without her weapon does not necessarily perform much better than Jingyi, Nicole, Caesar or Astra, depending on the team of course. But with her signature, she can completely blow all of her competition out of the water just by her pure existence in any team. In fact, she works so incredibly well, she can even somewhat keep up with lighter and Evelyn teams. But in the end, it all boils down to one critical point: her weapon. Whether you are using Caesar, Astra, Jingyi, Nicole or Trigger, without her weapon, Trigger might just not bring as much of a benefit to the team as you would hope for. Sure, the average player, especially in comparison to Nicole or even Rina, she is much easier to play and hence will likely already improve possible scores simply due to that. But her weapon gave me consistently an increase of nearly 20 to 25% in score across all of her best teams I have tested. And my units have had a mid-level investment, like sub 30 substat rolls. Due to the dev threat provided by her weapon, this scales very well with higher investment, well outside of pen ratio that is. This essentially means the better your units are built, the better Trigger and her weapon becomes. To just quickly illustrate that, let's take our imaginary damage of 10,000 and multiply it by Trigger's buffs. Taking this, rounded down, that will translate in roughly 4,678 damage. If we now add Trigger's buffs, we are at 7,307. That is an increase of about 56%. And if we were to do the same thing but for 20,000 damage, this would be 9,357 and 14,615 respectively, which is still an increase of 56%. But the effective damage gained is now 5,258 instead of 2,629. Because her buffs are multiplicative with other buffs and your stats outside of pen ratio, this essentially means that Trigger scales with your other unit strength. The better your carry is built, the better Trigger will be for them, and that directly translates also into more score. 20% of 20,000 are 4,000, but 20% of 40,000 are 8,000. But outside of the death threat, why else is her weapon so good? One of the reasons lies in her core. She gains up to 75% days to her aftershock attacks based on her crit rate. This caps out at 90% crit rate, and unfortunately for her, out of all the stun weapons currently available, only her signature does provide said crit rate. This also means to make full use of her core, we would be looking at 22 crit rate substat rolls when using a 2-piece woodpecker, or on average 4.4 crit rate rolls in all 5 slots outside of disc 4. As we can see here, the difference in terms of days can be massive, with basically every free-to-play weapon being able to even outperform her signature in terms of days if you manage to acquire that many crit rate substat rolls. And the keyword being here, if. For the average, casual, free-to-play player, this is a requirement I would personally consider close to impossible. However, I also do want to stress that it actually is not a requirement and it is not necessary maxing out her core. If you happen to do so, that is great, but it really is not required. Generally, her weapon options in terms of days are honestly great. It is the team's damage which suffers without her signature that is the much more so important reason. But let's say you want Trigger regardless, for aesthetic reasons or any other for that matter, but you cannot afford or want her signature. So what are your other weapon options? For free-to-play players, an R5 fossilized core is probably the by far best pick for Deadly Assault. The boss basically has one massive HP bar, which is only visually segmented, and that means you can expect a full 100% uptime on Fossil for the first 17,500 to 20,000 points, depending on your performance points. However, for Shiyu defense, Fossil falls off massively. Fortunately, it is still the best choice for free-to-play players unless you have Pulchra signature at R5. If you happen to lose your 50/50s a lot and acquired a Restraint, or you bought it in the shop, it is her second best choice for both days and damage, closely followed by Hellfire gears. Again, for Shiyu that is. It should also be noted that Trigger counts as being on field during her aftershock attacks, which means she will not actually profit from the likes of Hellfire gears off-field energy regeneration, but she also can in exchange receive on-field buffs such as Rina's pen ratio. Again, at least in theory, if you have her weapon, please do not play Trigger with Rina. Before we get to a conclusion, let's talk about the future implications and how future-proof Trigger actually really is. And truthfully, unless you are working at the ZZZ dev team, nobody knows. We don't know what the future will bring. The agents, the enemies, the environment or buffs in Deadly Assault or Shiyu defense, possibly even new other game modes. Heck, for all that matters, Hoyo would only need to introduce enemies with 0 defense and 10 billion HP instead to make all of our defense rate and pen ratio effectively useless. But outside of imaginary scenarios, we know from experience when looking at Star Rail or Genshin that power creep is inherently a thing. Just because it is very good now does not mean it will always be very good. If they introduce a pen ratio meta, she will fall off, and more so her weapon. Heck, even if you play her with Rina, she will already be much worse than other choices. Trigger is already better in Deadly Assault than she is in Shiyu defense, simply due to how the game mode works. And does that mean she is power creeping the game? Well, yesn't. She provides new multipliers for our damage, which we did not really have much access to before. Again, this essentially means she scales well with other buffers as well as how well built your units are. However, her weapon is a big part of that, and unless you are running her signature, you will be missing out on quite a bit of team damage. And that brings us full circle back to the beginning of the video. Does Trigger need her weapon? Well, no, nobody needs their weapon to function, but outside of Miyabi, Trigger is probably the unit which depends the most on it. Not even because of the crit rate it provides and the given interaction with her core passive, but even more so because of the team damage gain the weapon provides to the team. And that is regardless of the team. It applies as much to crit teams as it does to anomaly and disorder teams. So, should you pull for her? Well, I will not tell you to pull or not to pull. First of all, I don't like doing that. Secondly, I don't know your specific account. However, what I can do is provide you with my personal, generalized opinion. If you are either missing stunners, Caesar or Astra on your account, Trigger is not necessarily a bad investment even without her signature. In fact, she can be a good replacement to Astra in quite some teams, such as Miyabi teams, and hence frees up Astra for other teams, which can make overall team building much easier. And she also is still the best partner for Soldier Zero MB, even without her weapon. However, without her signature, she might also not perform up to your expectations. Not because Trigger is bad, but because you might already have other options on your account who can perform on a similar level. On the other hand, she also scales incredibly well with other buffers such as Astra or Nicole. For Nicole specifically because Death Threat is additive, but that is another topic. To sum this up, in my opinion, she is even or sometimes maybe even better than Astra depending on the team. Not because of the raw damage she provides by herself, but because of the damage buffs and because she scales with them. This, however, only really applies when we have her weapon as well. And with this, we also finally have an answer to the question I have asked back in my Soldier Zero MB guide.
So, does he need Trigger?
No, she does not need Trigger. Optimally, she would want Trigger with her signature. At least that is if you are a meta chaser and are looking for a large improvement over your current roster and Deadly Assault scores. Otherwise, you will likely already have units on your account who might be able to perform at the same level. They might just be a bit harder to play. As per usual, just because something is good, that does not mean you need it. Don't spend money you don't have, or better, don't spend money on gacha games at all. It does not matter if you can clear Deadly Assault with 20,000 or 40,000 points. It does not matter if you can clear Shiyu in 50 seconds or in 1 minute 30. If you have Qingyi, Astra, Nicole, Caesar, Rina, or even lighter, I would not recommend pulling for her. Unless you can also get her weapon. All of this does obviously not take into account the much more important factor of waifu and Gyat over meta. And in the end, regardless of her performance, if you like her, go for her. However, I did want to make this video as I want my guides to stay as neutral and objective as possible. But I also want to share my impression on her for people to be able to make a good decision for their account if they choose to do so. Thank you for watching. Peace.